Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey all, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a guest expert interview. My guest today is Yael Schonbrun, and she is a psychologist and mom, and she has written a wonderful book called Work, Parent, Thrive. We're going to be talking all about that. This was a really helpful episode for anyone who is trying to balance home life and work life. And I know Yael probably would not say that we're looking for balance, and she's going to talk more about that. But we really dove into all of the challenges that happen when we have those 2 roles, and sometimes it can feel hard, like we're not doing either well. So she really has some great strategies for what we can do if we are feeling that way. I also wanted to remind you how I can help you and how you can help us. How I can help you is that I have a free course called How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids. And it is for anyone who wants to dive into peaceful parenting or get back up on the wagon and really focus on your own emotional responses when things are challenging, because that's always where we start. So head on over to sararosensweet.com/yelling for my free course, How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids, and feel free to share that with a friend. This is for anyone and everyone who wishes that they could stay more calm when things are hard. And if you would like to support us and support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/peacefulparenting. That is a low-cost way to support us. It takes a lot of time and energy and money to bring this podcast to you every single week. So if you'd like to support us and check out the benefits that are available to you as a Patreon supporter, just go to patreon.com/peacefulparenting. Okay, let's dive in and meet Yael. Hi, Yael. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, me too. I was just telling you before we started, when I saw your book that came out in the fall, I believe, I was like, oh, I have to get her to come on the podcast. So can you tell us about who you are and what you do, and then about your book?
Sure. So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I actually started out in academia. I still have a foot there, but now I wear a lot of other hats in addition. So my investment is a little bit less in academic research. So I have a small private practice where I specialize in couples therapy as well as parent coaching. And I also have a podcast of my own, which is called Psychologists Off the Clock, that aims to translate research from psychology into accessible, fun tools and ideas and practices for the general public. And then I'm also a writer. I wrote this book called Work, Parent, Thrive that came out, as you said, in November. And that was born out of my own experience of becoming a working parent some years ago now. My oldest is now 12, but it was an interesting journey because I was very, very excited to become a parent, and I really liked my job, and I was pretty confident in my skills as an adult and a human with access to lots of tools from psychology and a supportive partner and all the things that you kind of dream of having is like, oh, this will work, right? And then lo and behold, I become a parent, and it turned out to be a lot harder in ways that I hadn't imagined in terms of the identity crisis and sort of the unhappiness that I felt wherever I was. So when I was with my kid, I would feel kind of ashamed of myself for getting lapped by my colleagues. And when I was at work, I would feel just so guilty and kind of rotten for having paid virtual strangers to be taking care of my tiny little beautiful creature. And so I started doing what nerdy people do and reading everything that I could get my hands on to kind of figure out, how am I going to do this thing that I've worked so hard to get to without feeling miserable constantly. And what I found in the bookstores and the libraries was pretty disheartening, which is why this book project came out, because most of what I found was kind of about the structures that are failing us, which is true. But I was kind of like, okay, well, that doesn't help me in terms of what I'm going to do today in the here and now. or it was about managing time more efficiently, which wasn't really my issue. And so I then turned to the academic literature, and there I found lots of things that got me really excited. First and foremost, because I'm a relationship researcher, I'm really interested in the relationship between people, but also things. And so I found this really interesting research on the relationship between our roles. So not only is there a lot of data looking at how work and family conflict with each other, but there's also this really fascinating research on how they enrich each other. And so I got really excited about that. And then I also got really excited about science from domains of rest and creativity, showing how the roles can help each other out. And so as somebody who's interested in relationship between things and in positive psychology, this book is sort of the bringing together of those passions.
I love that. And I love how you talked about this in the book too, how, yes, sure, we need a structural overhaul of how the working world is. And interesting today, I just heard on the radio the rise of the 4-day work week, which is really
Yeah.
feel like a possibility that more people are embracing that. But that's not going to happen overnight for parents who just, have this new baby, as you said, and like are realizing that this isn't working very well, like this conflict between the roles. When I had my first child, I was working in film and television, and I loved it so much. Like I just loved my job, and I had every intention of taking my 1-year mat leave because I'm in Canada. So we got the 1-year mat leave, and then I was going to go back. And then I ended up being a stay-at-home mom for 12 years because I couldn't picture how I was going to. I mean, I had a few forays back into the film world in those years, but I couldn't picture how I was going to make it work between being the kind of parent that I wanted to be and this job. And partly because there were no options to work less than a 60-hour-a-week job. So I was just like, I can't be away for 12 hours a day, So I ended up not working in that job and never going back to it because I just couldn't figure out how to make it work. And which is good because now I ended up doing what I'm doing now, which I love. But I was thinking about all of the ways that it was hard not to be a working parent when I was a stay-at-home parent. Like when I was reading your book, it really struck me and I read towards the end of the book, you talked about how you asked your mom if she felt that she would have been happier if she had been working when she was raising her children. And obviously we can't go back in time and make different choices, but I think it was hard on me not having a job, like a job outside of the home, because I think I felt like my self-esteem took a big hit in those years. Like to have like my job was taking care of the kids, which is great. But also, like your job performance reviews are always terrible when you have kids all day,
I
right? Like
know. You
I
never
hate
get
the
that
food
5
that
out of
you,
5
yeah,
from the kids.
exactly. I hate the food that you made. Why are you so mean? Like, it's just like people are complaining all day long about the job that you're doing. So I missed how I would get like those good, positive feedback from, my boss and the projects that I was working on. So I love that I could have used a more of an answer to this 22 years ago when I had my first child.
Yeah. Well, and this is not to say that, just to kind of point out the obvious, but stay-at-home parents can have very happy, fulfilling lives. It's not, the book is not suggesting that I think the way to go is working parenthood. It's more, which is kind of what you're saying, that we often think about working parenthood as being full of problems, but there are some real advantages, some real gifts that are embedded in what can be super challenging. And when we can recognize those gifts, we can harness them more. We can take advantage of them more skillfully. And one of the gifts, which is what you're pointing to, is that we can have multiple areas of competency and mastery and positive experience, joyful experience. And that helps us not to restrict our lives, constrict our lives, which can be problematic. And in fact, psychological research shows that having more roles gives us better access to happiness, better access to meaning and purpose. And that tends to be really good for our overall well-being. The problem is it's not without costs,
Mm-hmm.
because the more roles that we have, the more tension we have between competing demands. So both are true. And the question that I encourage people to pivot to is away from, how do I get away from tension and unhappiness? Because that's not a very good question, because what life involves is tension. Like in good, happy, rich, fulfilled lives, whether you're a stay-at-home parent or not, or a working parent, you're probably going to inhabit lots of different roles, and that's a good thing. But escaping the tension between roles is like an unwinnable battle if you have a very rich, full life. Instead, the question is, how can I help my roles balance each other and use that tension to my advantage? So it's a question of reframing the tension in a way that you can use in more productive ways. And exactly as you're saying, like getting a break and having more self-efficacy in lots of different pockets and having tangible rewards and not having everything count on whether your kids are happy with dinner or behaving well, and allowing that to feed your self-worth is one of the ways.
Yeah. And I think, I appreciate you bringing up the fact that it's not a question of which is better, being a stay-at-home or a working parent, or if there's even a contest. And I certainly didn't mean to suggest that I felt like a victim in my choice. I just didn't, I guess I just didn't, the job I was in then, I didn't see a way to make it work. But I think I did find ways to sort of bring in the working, not that it was a paid working world, but I found ways to find other interests that fed me. I was really into crafting and very sort of domestic arts types of things, like cake decorating and needle felting and things like that. And I had a blog, and I got lots of like positive feedback from that. So I think I did, I knew that I needed something outside myself and outside my children. And I think I would say I was pretty successful at that. So
yeah. That's so awesome. And that's such a great example of finding different ways to feed to sort of expand your self-concept. But, your other point, which is, but it doesn't offer some of the things that more traditional paid work does, which is, this very like structured kind of feedback and tangible compensation. And so, that's sort of, there's always advantages and disadvantages to everything. But that's one of the disadvantages of hobbies that on the one hand is really pleasant, because you're not being evaluated. On the other hand, there's something that's really satisfying about getting compensation. And going back to your original sort of point that my own mom, when I asked her, if she would have been happier, because she was a pretty unhappy stay-at-home mom. And I do think that exactly what you're saying was something that she didn't do. So she was really focused on being a parent and didn't have much outside of that. And in part, it was because she was an immigrant and she didn't speak English very well. And she also struggled with some mood stuff. So her life really was quite restricted. And so it really just gets to the point that the more that we can inhabit different pockets of life, the more balanced we'll be. And at the same time, that's going to create some tension between roles. But that's not a bad thing. It's more just a question of how do we navigate that most skillfully.
Yeah, for sure. I look back also to this is taking me sort of down a memory lane of those years for me. And I think that I also really threw myself into parenting professionally, if you know what I mean. Like I read what I could read, and I thought about parenting a lot. And that's how I ended up where I am today, because I got so like my type A personality, and my brain needed that sort of stimulation of that almost academic side of parenting, that I ended up as a parenting coach. So it's interesting to look back on those different choices.
And I'll say that that's the perfect example. So work-family conflict, which most people have heard of, is this idea that our roles compete for our finite resources. So like whatever time, energy, attention that you have, if you're devoting it to work, it's taking away from parenting. If you're devoting it to parenting, it's taking away from work. And that's a conflict for the finite resources. Work-family enrichment is the idea that our roles can feed each other in all sorts of really interesting ways. And I clarify sort of three distinct paths. So the first is the transfer effect, and that's a bit of what you're talking about. So when we're stepping into one role, we're actually building skills that can feed very naturally back into the other. So your example of stepping fully into parenting and making that a real project ended up feeding back into your professional life in a very cool, creative, inspiring way. And then the second path is the buffer effect. And that's the idea that no matter what, we're going to have stress in our given roles. And so having multiple roles can help us balance it out, both in terms of the overall perspective. So if you're having a really tough time with your kids, say you're in the service industry or you're a healthcare worker, it helps you to recognize like whatever problems your kids are having, there's a bigger world. People are struggling even more than your kids are. Some people are struggling less, but it gives you some perspective and vice versa. Also, if you have a rough day at work, you get to go home and have a hug with your kids. Or if your kids are in a phase where they're mouthing off to you, you get to go to work and have respectful conversations with colleagues. So there's that buffering opportunity.
I just want to stop you for a second, because I love that so much. And I think that so people don't think about that enough. So I love that you really brought that consciously to our attention. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. And then the third path is the additive effect. And that's the idea of how psychologists, in one frame, measure happiness is a sense of meaning and purpose. And the more roles that we inhabit, the greater our opportunity to cultivate a sense of meaning and purpose, either in the one role or sort of over through our lives, through the various roles that we inhabit overall, that we can sort of feel like our lives have purpose. We're having an impact. We're doing something that really counts in a more enduring way. And so I think, again, your example of using your parenting role to, over time, feed back into your professional trajectory is such a terrific example. And there's, most of us can think of various ways that if you inhabit multiple roles, that one role can actually feed back positively to the other. We just don't think about it that much. And so that's a part of what I really encourage people to do in my book, is to start reflecting on that, because the more that you are aware of it, the more that you can take advantage of it. So if you know, hey, when I step into parenting, I really practice patience and compassion and perspective taking, then you can really appreciate the way that when you step back into other roles, whether it's partnership or work, that you can take advantage of that grown skill, and that can help you to feel better about the balance of roles, even in the face of tension between them.
I love that. I want to shift gears a little bit. I promised you that I had a quote that I had heard from a celebrity just last week, and I heard it and I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what Yael was talking about. So Shonda Rhimes said in an
I
acceptance,
love her.
yeah, she's great. But she said in, I think, a graduation speech, she said something like, people ask me how I do it all. And she says, whenever you see me somewhere succeeding in one area of my life, that almost certainly means I'm failing in another area of my life. What would you say to her? And can we talk about that guilt? Because I know you talk about that parent guilt in your book.
Well, I love Shonda Rhimes, and I've heard her speak more positively. I read this Time magazine article that featured that was all about her life and her role as a parent and super productive director, producer. So that's more negative than I think of her, but it's interesting how people really do feel that way. Like, oh, I'm such a crappy parent because I went to work instead of chaperoning my child's field trip.
She went on to say, like, for example, if I'm in the boardroom going over some scripts or doing a script read or whatever, I'm most certainly missing, a concert at my kid's school. Or if I'm putting my kids to bed, I'm missing an important thing that's happening at work. So that was just the fuller context. I mean, it is negative, I guess, but it's also, I guess it must just be the reality of the choices that she has to make.
So I think it is a reality, but there's so many ways to frame that reality. And I think one is I'm failing my kids when I'm working because I'm not there to show up for their important events. But another is, and it's the exact same reality, it's just a different mindset on it, is that I'm modeling for my kids what hard work is and how to juggle multiple roles. And I'm modeling for them that I'm there for them and I love them, even though I can't show up for every single moment. I'm also modeling for them that I believe that they can be independent and that they'll be okay even when I'm not around, that they'll figure it out, that they'll find ways to be proud of themselves, and that we'll come back together and reconnect. So both are true. And here's the complexity here, is that it is both hard on your kids when you're not there for them to pick them up from an embarrassing failure or to celebrate a terrific accomplishment. That's tough on them, right? Your kids want you there with them and you want to be there for them. It's also good for them. Same time, exact same time, both are true. It's good for them to build resilience. It's good for them to know that they can be uncomfortable and that not being there for one another is a part of any close relationship over the lifetime journey that relationships take, and that you can still love somebody even when you're imperfectly there because there's no other way to be, right? We are imperfectly there for each other in any close relationship that sustains itself over time. And so I think making space for both truths is a part of what I want people to come away with in this idea of work-family enrichment, because work-family enrichment doesn't mean that everything is enriching all the time. It means that the conflict, the painful experiences are a part of how we grow, how we learn, how we understand our own strengths, how we understand our own weaknesses, how we figure out the messy journey of life that involves multiple roles and multiple relationships and tension between it all. And that we can experience the difficulty and at the same time access the gifts. It's both.
So do you think that's the anti-guilt answer, or is there more to it than that?
There's a little more to it than that because, okay, so guilt is an important emotion to pay attention to because it's wired into us for a reason. So all emotions serve a function. So this is an area of functional emotion research, and we understand a good bit about what each of the emotions helps us to do. And they're all from like an evolutionary perspective, emotions are wired into us for survival and reproductive purposes. Guilt specifically is an interpersonal emotion that's intended to protect relationships because part of what ensures our survival is that we're connected to people that we care about and that we sort of stay a member of the community, and also that we protect the offspring that we have. And so guilt is really strong for parents because we need it in pre-modern times to be very attentive to our very vulnerable young. The problem is that there's this evolutionary mismatch where we now feel guilty in times that our offspring are not at all in danger. So once upon a time, if you felt guilt, you'd like pay attention, make sure that your kid wasn't, sort of exposed to a predator coming by. Now, when we feel guilty because we're missing the field trip or the show that our kid is in, our kid is not in actual mortal danger. And they're not even terribly in a psychological danger because they might be uncomfortable, but the discomfort is not the problem in and of itself, right? However, sometimes guilt cues us in ways that are just totally not productive, right? Like if my kid is unhappy and I feel guilty every time they're unhappy, that's going to prompt me to come in, swoop in, and try to give them a cookie so that they feel better, or call the parent whose child said something nasty and make sure that my child, it's like that hovering, intensive, overprotective parent. And that creates a lot of fragility and lack of self-competence in our kids. Not so good. So if we pay attention to the guilt hook, line, and sinker, that's actually going to cause us to be not very healthy, productive parents. So we don't want to pay full attention to it. We want to notice it and ask ourselves whether or not it's serving us well or not. Because there are times that it is serving us well. Like if I've worked late all week and I haven't connected with my kids, my kid is probably okay, but I'm going to start finding that my connection with them is not as solid and stable. And so that guilt is actually quite a useful cue. Same thing goes for work. Like if my kid has been emotionally needy and I haven't been attending to projects and my clients are starting to let me know, like, you're dropping the ball, and I start to feel guilty, that's actually a good cue. Am I doing right by my role in my professional life? So we want to pay attention to it. So it's the noticing, asking, how useful is this guilt in terms of what I know about what's important to me in this role, what really matters, what are sort of the ends that I'm aiming for, versus how much is this guilt just kind of a hangover effect of evolution that actually is not terribly productive. And if you notice that it's not terribly productive, you can notice it and follow along with what a more value-guided action would be. Or if you notice, oh, no, this guilt is really telling me something quite important, then you can allow the guilt to drive the behavior. So it's not either or, it's sort of noticing and choosing.
That's so helpful. So it's an invitation to just really get clear on what's important. Well, prioritizing what the most important thing is, and finding that, I don't want to say balance, but yeah, no, that's great. I can't add on to what you said.
Yeah.
And I was thinking too, when you said that, the guilt of being worried that our child's unhappy because we couldn't, go to their concert or pick them up or whatever the thing is, and that it's not actually a predator. But I think for some people, when they're uncomfortable with feelings, it can feel as much of an emergency as, as a tiger or whatever. If they're really, if their child's unhappiness or difficult feelings feel really threatening to them. So that's also an invitation to get more comfortable with the feelings, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the problem, is like our feelings, like our brain is not very good at distinguishing between, like, is this a tiger or is this just a feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the practice is. And so I practice a treatment called acceptance and commitment therapy. And a lot of the practices that are embedded in this treatment are ones that help us to clarify for ourselves, like, this emotion is coming up. And if I get hooked on it, it's hard for me to notice that difference. Is this a tiger or is this just a field trip
Mm-hmm.
or whatever? But the more that we can unhook from the feeling, unhook from the story about the tiger and say, okay, my body is having an emotional reaction, or my brain is having a thought, or my mind is telling me a story. Can I take a step back and just get curious about it, as opposed to being fused with it? There's this word that we use. Fused with it means that we just kind of follow it down to its not logical extreme. versus when we unfuse, when we unhook from it and get curious, my mind is telling me that, or I'm feeling that way. How much does that line up with the kind of parent that I want to be? How much does that line up with the kind of worker that I want to be? And that curiosity gives us an opportunity to sort of question, is this really a tiger, or is this just my mind saying tiger, tiger, tiger?
Yeah, so you talk in your book about unhooking from unhelpful labels, which is what you're sort of just talking about. Can you get maybe a little bit more specific and strategic about, say, we have an unhelpful label that if we're not at all of the school concerts, then we're a bad parent. Like, say we've got that sort of like running around in our mind. How would you walk a parent through unhooking from that unhelpful label?
Yeah. Oh gosh, we have so many unhelpful labels that get kind of caught in our psyches. And I actually, so I'll share this story because I shared it in the book, and I just think it's a great one. But I interviewed a comedian who many evenings would go to do comedy shows. She actually was otherwise mostly around, but in the evening, so she would sometimes miss bedtime. And she would feel, she like a lot of her comedy routine was self-deprecating, as comedians do. And so she would be like, yeah, I'm a crappy mom, and my kids know that I'm a crappy mom. And her oldest son, would like say snarky things like, oh, you're going to go to the seedy bar instead of hanging with your kids. Like, great parenting, Ma. And she would like leave the house and feel super rotten. And during this interview, I started talking to her about this idea of unhooking from unhelpful labels. And she was trying to come up with like funny ways to talk about this concept of work family enrichment. And she was like, how about WOPO flow? Because you're kind of like flowing along instead of getting stuck on a label. But then in the process of talking about these concepts, she texted me one night and said, you asked me, you were talking about this concept of like getting stuck on labels. And so I asked my son, what do you really think about me going off to the comedy shows? Do you really think that makes me a terrible parent? And he said, no, I think it's super cool. And it was like this aha moment for her, where she was kind of like, oh, like it never had occurred to her to ask if he was just joking. She had just gotten so hooked on it. She believed that he believed it, so she started to believe it, and it kind of fed on itself. And she, her mind was doing the confirmation bias thing, where every time something went wrong, she'd be like, there's more evidence that I stink. And then this questioning of, is that label even serving me? How true is it? And how helpful is it? Invited her to ask her son what he thought. And then it was this like opening up of opportunity of, okay, that's just a name that I sometimes apply to myself. It's not truth with a capital T. And it's not even something my son particularly believes in. And so similarly, I think any parent, the first practice is to start noticing, like when you feel really tight or really kind of rotten about whatever the role is that you're in, what are the labels, what are the stories or words that you get hooked on? Is it, I'm a crappy parent, or I'm inadequate, or my kids are going to, write all about how rotten I was in the memoir, and they're going to end up on the therapist couch. And so what are the stories? What are the labels? What are the words that I apply? And then do this very simple practice, which is, my mind is telling me, right? So you add this prefix. My mind is telling me that I'm a failure. My mind is telling me the story of how I'm inadequate as a parent. And this brief prefix, my mind is telling me, is one of the activities, one of the practices that you can engage that helps you to get just a tiny bit unhooked from the thought. So as opposed to being fused with it, you're taking a step back using this phrase, and now you're able to look at it with curiosity. And then the question is, how helpful is that? It's not how true it is, because there's always going to be some truth and some false, right? Because there's nothing that's all true or all false. Sometimes you're less awesome as a parent than others, and that's just the reality.
And you might not have a kid who's so cool and enlightened to say, no, I actually think it is cool, right? You might not have any evidence that points to the fact that it's not true what your mind is telling you.
Exactly. So the more useful question is, how helpful is it in sort of inviting me to be more of the kind of parent, or more of the kind of worker, or whatever the role is, more of the kind of person that I want to be in this world? Because if crapping all over yourself helps you to be a better person, maybe it's worth it. But most of the time it doesn't. We have a belief that self-criticism helps us to be better, but it doesn't. It actually causes more shame. It causes us to retract. I mean, just think about this. Like if you go into a job interview and you tell yourself like, I suck, they should definitely not hire me, I am totally inadequate. Like, is that going to help you to be most engaging and dynamic and look intelligent and personable? Quite the opposite for the vast majority of people. I would argue most, if not all, people are going to do less well than if they were to tell themselves, I got this, right? I'm not perfect, but I have a lot to offer this job. I'm going to go in there and show them what I have to give. So that self-criticism really gets in our way. And so that's why it's helpful to unhook from those cruel labels, not necessarily because they're untrue, although mostly they're a little bit untrue or a lot untrue, but because they really interfere with showing up as our best selves.
Yeah, you
in
can't
whatever the
be
role is.
your best comedian or your best parent if you're feeling bad about whatever you're not doing when you're there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're a comedian and you're feeling just awful about yourself as, in this most important role, it's hard to be funny.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, going back to something you said before, it was a fear that I had that my kids didn't see me doing anything that was like important or I mean not okay, I don't want to say that raising children is not important, but there was this contrast between their dad who like left for work every day with a suit and a briefcase and like me who was still like in my pajamas, getting people off for school. So, I can see how, for anyone out there who is feeling bad about not being able to be at home all the time, I think it's really important to remember that role, that the example that you're being for your kids about what, especially women is what I'm talking about from my own experience, what women are capable of and what women can do. So I just wanted to kind of, you said that, but I wanted to kind of just reinforce it a little bit.
Yeah, and recognize that sometimes when we fall into that, I'm not doing important work or, really strong, impactful people go into the workforce, that our kids start to pick up on that. And what would we say to a friend who was a really good stay-at-home parent? We'd be like, you're doing the most important
Well,
work.
I thought it was important. I just didn't think that they thought it was important. I
Yeah.
I
But
felt like they saw more of a reflection of society, and that if I were really smart, I'd be out doing something else or whatever.
yeah, but it seems to me, and this is how I feel with my kids because I'm more the default parent. I do a lot more just week to week of the parenting than my spouse does for a variety of reasons. But it's like an opportunity to teach our children a corrective message than what society often gives. And I'm sure you did that with your kids, but I talk about that with my kids all the time, that their dad does important work and I do important work. And some of it is my professional work and some of it is my parenting work. And that it's all important. And some of it gets paid more than others, but that has nothing to do with how important it is. And so I
Mhm.
think that's such a valuable opportunity it's kind of a grassroots movement. Like with our kids, we can start to shift some of the messaging that exists in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Eve Rodsky.
Yeah, I love her.
Yeah, she's great, and that's such a Fair Play is such a wonderful book. But I think that the reason why we end up with the default parent feeling and being more unappreciated in a lot of relationships and in our culture is because of just conditioning, right? And so starting to change that, what
Hmm.
she says, like, the time in the boardroom should be worth as much as the time like awake with a kid in the night with the throw up bucket or whatever.
Oh, for sure. And I have to say that as somebody who has really straddled, some version of kind of sort of stay-at-home parenting and kind of sort of ambitious professional life in a strange way, I think the stay-at-home parenting is way harder.
Yeah.
It's like way more valuable and definitely, definitely harder. But there is this reality that it doesn't get compensated. I write about this in my book, but my mom used to, when she felt this injustice acutely, and she would constantly calculate how much she would be earning if she was doing the work not within the family but for others. I think just to prove that her effort had value. And wouldn't it have been so nice if she had already gotten that message from the world at large? Your
Hmm.
work does matter,
Hmm.
right? It might not get compensated in the way, but it matters a lot. And yes, it should be compensated, but that isn't, sort of the reality.
For sure. There's one or two more things that I really wanted to ask you about this to highlight. I mean, and there's so much in your book that we're not even touching on. So everyone really should, every parent who's looking for that work family enrichment should check out your book. But there were two more things that I wanted to bring up. One is when you're talking about subtracting rather than thinking that adding more things is the answer to finding, a happier life as a working parent. Can you talk a little bit about subtracting?
Totally. Yeah, it's probably one of my favorite chapters. And the irony is that was an added chapter, not a subtracted chapter. When I first went under contract, actually didn't know this research. I came into contact with the researcher who has his own book called Subtract. His name is Leidy Klotz during the writing of the book. What his research shows, which is really fascinating, is that the human brain is really wired to add. So when we confront a problem in life, our most common response is, what more can we do? I mean, all you need to do is look at the self-help shelves at the bookstore and you realize like it's all about doing more, like more mindfulness, more time management, more boxes from the Container Store to organize your mess. And I will say it is complemented by a section of the a self-help section that's about less, like Marie Kondo's work or Greg McKeown, who wrote Essentialism. The problem with those is that they don't address why it's so hard to get to less. So we like the idea of less, but we're constantly confronted with more. And then even when we do have this idea of wouldn't less be nice, like I can see the idea, the appeal of a schedule with fewer things on it and a dinner table that has, just a few like simple ingredients or a closet that is really, capsule closet. Like I see the appeal of it. But when I go to organize my closet, I just don't know how to get from point A to point, clear and zen. And the reason, as Leidy Klotz's research shows, is this wiring of the brain that we default to adding. And the title of his paper that landed in Nature is that humans systematically overlook subtraction as an option. So the idea that is revealed very clearly in his research is that we systematically overlooked subtraction as a life design option. And so what that teaches us is that, one more piece of his research is that when we're overwhelmed, when we're cognitively burdened, we're even more likely to overlook subtraction. So just when you're the busiest is actually the time that you're least likely to consider taking something off of your plate, which is pretty unfortunate because the more busy you are, the more you're likely to say yes to things that you shouldn't be doing is not a good recipe. And yet it's what most of us feel we're doing. I know that I do. Like it's the rushed trip through Target that lands me with like a whole cartload of items that I really don't need. And then I don't have time to return them. So it really is kind of this self-perpetuating problem. And so the sort of fix, and this isn't quite a hack as much as a practice, is to recognize our brains do not default to taking things off our plate, especially when we're really overwhelmed. And so what we need to do instead is sort of manually override that tendency by developing practices to really consider subtraction. So what they found in their experiments is that when they cued people, like subtraction is also an option, that people were less likely to overlook it and more likely to seriously consider it. So what I personally do as a weekly practice is I look at my schedule and I think to myself, is there anything that can come off this list? And whenever I add something new to my closet, I ask myself, is there anything really that should leave? Like, what can I take out? And I also have certain rules of thumb based on my experience of knowing that there's certain activities that are not value aligned that take a lot of resources from me and from my family, that when they land on the calendar, it's time to really rethink it. So for me, this is a silly example, but birthday parties, I don't like hosting them. I don't really love going to them because for me, it's like a lot of party favors and they're often indoors at these places that feel really generic and cement blocky. I just don't like them. And I think that there's other ways to get at what birthday parties are trying to get at, which is connectivity and celebration. And I'd rather do other kinds of activities. And so when there is a birthday party option, either to host or to attend, it's something that I don't default to yes. And that's a practice that we have in our family where we say, is this your absolute best friend? If not, it'll probably be a no. And in terms of hosting birthday parties, we do gatherings like every couple of years, but other than that, we just do family events. And so that's sort of a way that we kind of keep the chaos on that front to a minimum. And it's become a practice of subtracting, of not adding, and then when it lands on the calendar to consider seriously subtracting it. And so I think, again, recognizing that the tendency, the wiring, is to default to adding, and that we do so more when we're overwhelmed. And so to override that by building in subtracting practices.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I'm working with families who are having a hard time, one of the first things I do is ask them to tell me about their schedule, like their typical morning, evening routine, what they do on the weekends. And often my suggestion is, what can you stop doing? It's like, do you really need that many extracurricular activities? Do you really need to go to the science center on Saturday or whatever. I mean, unless that is really what brings you joy, but really just to getting people to that activity of stopping to think about all of the things that they're doing and really making sure that it's in line with the kind of lifestyle they want to have.
I love so much what you're doing. Two things that I'll just point out. So one is that you're basically suggesting a stop doing list, which Leidy Klotz talks about. Like next to your to-do list, have a stop doing list and be clear and curious about what should go on that list. The second thing you're doing is you're really encouraging people to ask, what are your values and are the activities that you're committed to lining up with your values? Because if they're not, then seriously consider placing them onto your stop doing list.
Yeah.
So it's a values clarification and also this practice, a stop doing list that can be really helpful to finding ways to live more in line with your values.
Yeah. There's so much pressure to that, the acronym of weird parents,
Yes.
There's this acronym for people who don't know I know about it through
Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic.
Yeah, that's basically North American parenting model. But there's so much pressure to have like all of the lessons and all the activities and a bath every day, which I always tell people you don't have to give your kids a bath every day. But
we do twice a week.
We did too.
Probably, yeah.
We did Wednesdays and Sundays, so I wouldn't forget.
It's so funny. We do Thursdays and Sundays. See, like we're in lockstep. And it is one of those things where I think you worry about the judgment. Other people are going to be like, your kids are gross. But our brains are wired to worry about judgment because we want to be part of the community. But so many of the things that we worry about, this is, again, the hangover. Like, nobody's going to kick me out of their group because my kids only bathe twice a week.
Yeah.
I don't know maybe when my oldest hits puberty, but
you know what?
When we get there.
Having 3 kids who've gone through that, this is the beauty, is they start to care about how they smell because they're starting to get interested in romance. And so you don't have to bug them anymore about bathing once they hit that age.
Yeah. I love that you only do twice a week. That's great.
Yeah. And I honestly, I had to choose the days or we'd forget. Like, okay, we better say Wednesdays and Sundays or we'll forget and a week will go by and no one will have had a bath.
Exactly.
But I think it's the idea of trying to do less. You really have to confront why am I, as you said, the values, but it is so hard to go against the grain of, I imagine you came up against that with birthday parties.
100%. And so I think, and again, this is a practice from acceptance and commitment therapy, is that it's very, very easy to follow what social mores would dictate, but that's not necessarily your value. And so the practice is to clarify what's important for you and your family, and to recognize that that's going to bring up discomfort of, I'm doing something really different than other people are doing. Like my kids have a lot of afternoons that they don't have extracurriculars. And not only is it going to bring up discomfort, do other people think that I don't care, or, but it's also, are my kids going to get behind? Are they going to be less competitive when they get to college? But then get curious about that. Like, how much does that really matter? And what does the science say? And hint, hint, like the science actually says that it's good for your kids to do less, and that actually they'll be more prepared for college if they know how to be on their own, how to be a little bored, how to not be directed in activities from adult constantly, that all of those are really good things. So some of those social pressures and some of those fears that are embedded in us in our weird society turn out to be pretty false, and yet they're driving a lot of our parenting behavior. And so by unhooking from it and clarifying your personal family values, you get to follow dictates that are a lot more fitting and value aligned.
Yeah, which makes you with that better work-family enrichment. And we've brought it full circle. So this is a great time to wrap things up. This has been such a helpful conversation. I know that so many parents are going to want to learn more about you and what you do. So before I ask you my last question, maybe you could just tell everyone where they can find out more about you. What's the best place to connect?
Sure. You can follow me if you like Sarah's podcast. You might also like mine, which again is called Psychologists Off the Clock. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And my writing website is workparentthrive.com, which is also the title of my book.
It's a great title, by the way. I'm currently trying to think of a new name for my business, and I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks and I still haven't come up with anything. So
titles are so hard. I like peaceful parenting.
Well, peaceful parenting is kind of like saying yoga clothes or low carb diet. Like there are lots of people who do peaceful parenting. Yeah. So now that I'm not only myself, was Sarah Rosensweet peaceful parenting, but now I have to think of a name that other people will like to say. I'm a blah, blah, blah peaceful parenting coach. So if anyone
Yeah.
listening has an idea, let me know. Actually,
Titles
but
are
probably
so
by the time
hard.
this podcast comes out, I'll have thought of something. So, okay. So the last question that I want to ask you is a question that I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest tip that I would give myself is not, but the problem is, I think that my husband gave me this advice. I just could not hear it, but it would be, don't sweat the small stuff. Because when your kids are little, I think this is especially true for mom. And I think there is a biological drive and there's definitely a social motivation for this. We just worry about all the things, like the amount of sleep that I lost over what they were eating or not eating, or the poop or the motor development that they were having. Like, it was just agony. I worried over so many things that were just non-issues. So it would be, don't sweat the small stuff, and maybe even like look at the data for what actually you need to worry about, because then it would give me something to do when worries came up, as opposed to just ruminating on them.
Right. I love that. I saw this comedian once, like it was like a YouTube video or something, where she was at a pretend job interview and the person interviewing her started asking her questions. And he said, "So when did you first learn to walk? When did you take your first steps?" And she was like, "What?" And she answers, and he says, "So when did you stop pooping in your pants?" And like just all of these, the things that we worry about when they're little that really have no bearing on their adult lives, right?
100%. And that's why I love parenting writers, including Melinda Winter-Moyer and Emily Oster, because they help parents to dive into some of the data in really accessible ways of like, none of that stuff matters. Nobody's going to ask you in your job interview. The likelihood that it's a problem is so small, and the attention that we're giving to it is really blinding us from many other things that matter a lot more, even just in terms of our enjoyment of the moment.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such an honor and so much fun to speak with you.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.